Who are you? How would you answer that? And are you living in a way that's true to who you are? I often start off my new mindfulness series exploring this question by having two people ask each other, who are you? So one person asks and the other person responds for 3 minutes uninterrupted. And what I find is that generally, in this first round, they talk about the more external layer of who they are. They talk about their work, their hobbies, their friends, all of which are really important, but none of which are who they fundamentally are. And so then they ask a second time, they'll ask, who are you again? And this time, I ask them to get a little bit more cosmic in their answer. So after wondering what they've done signing up for my class, they start to get a little vulnerable. So they talk about their struggles in their past, the fact that they have anxiety, and other pains that they have. But what I find is that for most people, no matter what they said, there is still something in them that realizes that that's not who they are either. But I don't have them ask for a third time because for most people, who they are beyond these two initial layers is largely unexplored territory and really difficult to put into words. I lived 25 years of my life with the deep suffering of ignoring who I was because I was scared, because I didn't want to hurt anyone, and because I didn't really love myself enough to change. And so when I came to meditation, I came for some relief, but what I found was that the pain was not actually coming from the core of who I was. The pain was coming from how I was relating to who I was. So through mindfulness, I began to learn and accept who I was within and beyond those two layers, and the transformation that has happened from there has given me a kind of peace and happiness that I could never have expected. So I'd like to share with you today a framework in 4 steps on how mindfulness transforms us, both from my own experience and the experiences of many who have been doing this practice for over 2,500 years. So the first step is like the gateway of mindfulness. It's coming to this heightened realization that the new kicks, the girlfriend, even getting an A boarding group on Southwest, don't actually bring you sustained inner peace and happiness. You're happy for a bit, and then you get used to it, and then you're on to something else. And then on top of that, everything ends, breaks, or dies. So no wonder it is so hard to be happy as a human when there is always something between you and happiness. And so many people live their whole lives in a habit of believing that if only I become less or more this or have more of that, then I'll be happy. So when people come to meditation, this represents a willingness to step outside of this endless cycle of if only, to practice being present with who we are and what we have right now. So I'd like to invite you to try this practice out with me, because in the same way that I can't talk at you about playing piano and then you become a virtuoso, I can't talk at you about mindfulness and then you become more mindful. Unfortunately, the brain doesn't work like that. So through neuroplasticity, our brain actually develops based on how we use it. And so when we practice mindfulness through meditation, our brain develops its capability to be mindful and compassionate. And that's really why it is a practice and not a philosophy or magic. It's accessible to everyone. And so let's try out this practice. And to start, I'll just ask that you close your eyes. And this just helps bring attention inward. And just feel what it feels like to be in this body, in this space, and in this moment. And bringing your attention to your breathing in this body. So following it as you breathe in and breathe out. And breathing in again. And breathe out. The breath is always present and a reliable place to come back to. Just continuing to follow your breathing. And you might notice thoughts like to take your attention away. And so all you have to do when you notice that happens is observe where your mind went and then come back to your breath. Learning how to come home to who you are. And now taking one more mindful breath and opening your eyes. So for some of you, that might have felt nice. For others, that might have felt awkwardly long. And for most of you, you probably noticed a lot of thoughts, and that's actually part of the practice. So as we continue to practice, we become really conscious of what takes us away from inner peace and happiness. Because when we meditate, we try to be present, and then we notice all of the thoughts and the emotions and our top 10 tunes that really like to get in the way of that. It's as though the waves of the mind start to settle enough for us to see more clearly what's going on underwater. And rather than our normal life where we're too distracted to notice, we ignore it, or we get really caught up in it, we learn how to notice it, to gain insight from it, and to let it pass. And that starts to create space for us to choose our response from a wiser place. I remember one summer, I was getting into my car, and it was extremely hot. And I noticed in me all of this irritation and this inner complaining, and because of my practice, I could be aware of it without being totally caught up in it. And it gave me the space to remember that just a few months ago, I had paid for this exact same experience at the sauna. And so that changed my whole perspective, because suddenly I realized that it wasn't actually the heat itself that was causing my suffering, but it was my resistance to the heat. So rather than being the complainer and being the irritation, I was able to be the noticer of the irritation and complaining and choose to let it go. And so as we start to get less caught up in our emotions and our thoughts, we start to have greater access to this third layer of who we are, our more kind, our kind, wise, and conscious self, where our true values live. As we become familiar with who we are, and as we start to allow thoughts and emotions to go without getting caught up in it, we start to discover our true nature. And through meditation, we get this in glimpses of the quiet, peaceful mind and what it is to just be. And we discover the joy, compassion, and peace of our true nature. And this experience is one of connectedness, it's one of aliveness, and it's one of a deep contentment. As we start to discover who we are, it becomes natural then that all of the layers of our being start to transform from this place. I would never have expected that such a simple practice would transform every corner of my life, from how I eat to how I speak to the work I do and the habits that I have. And these changes haven't come because it's New Year's, or because from a place of self-hatred or the delusion that maybe this thing will bring me happiness. These changes have come from a wiser and more compassionate place in me. Through meditation, I finally gained this self-compassion and the insight to come to terms with being transgender, and that my brain had developed as male and my body got a different message. And after I came out to my family, I went home and I found these journals that my mother had kept of me as a young child. And I discovered that from the age of 2 and for several years, I was persistently telling my parents that I was a boy. And when they would tell me that I was a good girl, I would say no. I would start crying and tell them that I was actually a good boy. And I think they might have just thought I was really stubborn. But as I read these journals, I remembered my first short haircut as a child and what it felt like to feel embodied, a feeling of really being seen for who you are, and it was a feeling that I would lose for decades after. As I saw that this is what I'd always been, Any doubt that I had that maybe I was making these changes out of a place of pain went away. I knew then that I was making these changes from a wiser place out of compassion for my pain. And it became clear to me then that mindfulness is a transformative practice that brings us back home to who we are before we are ever told who we should be. And that brings us a deep level of happiness that we can't find externally. There's an old story in Thailand of a group of monks that had to move this really big clay Buddha statue into their new temple. And when they tried to move it, it was unexpectedly heavy, and it dropped, and some of the clay broke off. And they found a little bit of gold underneath. So after they investigated further, they found that actually the whole statue had been made of gold, and that hundreds of years before, the Burmese army had threatened to come to town, and so they covered it with clay to try to protect it. The analogy here is that over the course of our lives, we pile on layers of clay that we use to protect ourselves, but eventually we too forget the gold we really are. We forget that the clay was just a remnant of the past and no longer who we are today. Through mindfulness, we learn the skill of shedding the clay by getting close to and transforming our clay and our suffering and getting in touch with the gold that we are. And this is so important to me because when we're covered in clay and when totally caught in our stresses and our striving and our suffering, we don't have as much access to our gold. We don't have as much access to the innate compassion we have to be open to and to do something about the suffering of others. And the words and actions we make out of our clay, out of our fear and our pain, can cause tremendous harm. Over 40% of transgender people try to kill themselves. And it's not because of who they are at their core. It's because so many in this world have yet to learn how to turn inward and to access compassion that they have for others and for themselves. And this is just one kind of unnecessary pain our society has not yet learned how to help transform. I don't think that world peace and greater global happiness are going to happen because one day all of the governments come together and decide that now is the time for a more harmonious, enlightened world. It has to start small. We have to practice it and build it inside of ourselves. And then we need to practice it the next time we're cut off on 64. Every moment is an opportunity for practice. And if we can meet the world in this way, we can begin to transform from the inside out. Thank you.